We're very focused on this idea of multidimensional struggle and intersectionality, which essentially tells us that there are many people in our society that are engaged in or experiencing very intense forms of both institutional and individual discrimination, things such as racism, ageism, classism, body discrimination, religious discrimination, xenophobia, patriarchy, sexism, colorism, ableism, transphobia, homophobia, heterosexism, and citizenism, to name a few. And so we are talking about these because we believe that the more you understand about this struggle and the more you know about where you stand within it in terms of your own intersectional experience with race, class, gender, sexuality, etc., the more that we can do to eliminate this kind of discrimination. And so I offered you an article about agencies of transformational resistance and also about the concept of transformational resistance. And the reason I offer you this is because it's a theoretical concept that really helps you to think about where you stand in this whole scope of discrimination. So some of my colleagues at UCLA, Dolores Delgado Bernal, Daniel Solorzano, they've theorized this idea of resistance because they've come to define the different ways that people resist discrimination and or the way that they react to it. And so I have this diagram here. It's a diagram of resistance that highlights four different kinds of resistance. So the first one is called reactionary or defiant behavior. It is not resistance necessarily because, for example, if you're thinking about students, the students who lack both a critique of their oppressive conditions and the motivation of toward social justice or liberation, they might just be reactionary. And then there might be some people who are engaged in self-defeating resistance. This refers to students or people who may not have some type of critique of their oppressive conditions, but are not who may have some critiques of their oppressive conditions, but are not motivated by an interest in liberation or social justice. These students engage, for example, in behaviors that is not transformational and in fact may help to recreate the oppressive conditions from which it originated, right? And so then you also have conformist resistance, which refers to the oppositional behavior of students who are motivated by a need for liberation and social justice, yet hold no critique of the systems of domination. These students are motivated by a desire to create social justice, yet engage in activities and behaviors within a more conservative tradition. They want to improve their things, but they are likely to blame themselves, their families, or their cultures for the negative conditions they find themselves in. Finally, we have transformational resistance, and this is the type of resistance that I am most concerned with in my own work and also in trying to promote a different kind of change, right? So transformational resistance is a form of behavior that is accompanied with a critique of domination and a desire for self or social liberation. In other words, the student or the person must hold an awareness of, and critique of their oppressive conditions and structures of domination, and they must be motivated by a sense of social justice. With a deeper level of understanding and social justice orientation, transformational resistance offers the greatest possibility for social justice. All right, so I'm going to go back to the diagram and look at that here. So in the top left-hand corner, you have the self-defeating resistance. That's, again, someone who has a lot of critique of this, of the multidimensional consciousness, right, of the multidimensional struggle. They know racism exists, they know sexism exists, etc. However, if they're not motivated by social justice, then their behavior may be considered self-defeating. For example, in grade school or even in college or at a job, someone who is leaving a job or leaving school and or sabotaging their own careers or their own goals because of the racism that they're experiencing, that might be considered self-defeating. In other words, they know racism is in place or sexism or homophobia, but they're not motivated to change it, right? And so then you have the people in the lower left-hand quadrant of the diagram, those are the reactionary folks. Those are people who have no critique of social oppression. In other words, they don't even think racism exists. They don't think sexism exists or homophobia. They have no critique of the fact that there are injustices that are at play. However, they might feel their existence in their life, and yet they're not motivated to change it. So they might be reactionary. They might be people who are engaged in violence, in hatred, just generally angry at society and the world, but again, no interest in changing it. Then you have people who are in the bottom right hand corner. That's the conformist resistance folks. Those are people who are motivated by social justice, either personal or collective, but they have a very low critique of social oppression. They might have some, but not completely. So, in other words, those are people who maybe they've experienced some discrimination themselves, and maybe their families have, but they don't realize how intense that discrimination is and how institutionally how it exists in the world, right? And so I always say a lot of us who are professionals, people like teachers, people like social workers, people who are in business, for example, people who are politicians, a lot of those people have a motivation for personal or collective social justice. They want good lives, they want better lives for their families, they even want better lives for society. But because they have no critique of social oppression or very low critique of racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, they end up being conformist, right? They conform to the way that society is, which is very much a society that is built upon social injustice and social inequality. So these people are conformists. Many of us are those people, myself included. However, the higher my critique of social oppression is, the more engaged I am in understanding the way that racism functions in our society, both on a personal level and a collective level, and in the way that sexism and homophobia, transphobia, anti-immigrant, and the religious discrimination, all of those things, the more that I expand my multidimensional consciousness, multidimensional understanding of the isms and phobias, the more that I can engage in transformative resistance. Because if I'm highly motivated by social justice and I have a high critique of social oppression, then I can engage in what we're calling transformative resistance, right? And so this is that red or highlighted quadrant in the top right hand corner of the diagram. It is what we all are striving for as critically conscious scholars, or as activists, as community folk engaged in social justice work. We are interested in a transformative resistance that engages in social change at a society level. And then I'll end with some examples. Some of the things that I've been looking at is agencies of transformational resistance. My colleague Alejandro Covarrubias and myself created a point, kind of like several points that would identify an agency of transformational resistance. This is kind of like an organization or a space or even a classroom, right? What they do is they raise multidimensional political and social consciousness. They foster a commitment to social justice and activism. If you're looking at the university, it's both on and off campus. You provide the skills necessary for marginalized people and or students to survive and succeed, and you create connections to multiple communities, or what we call networks of resistance. And finally, you work to create safe spaces for marginalized students in education or in a workspace or in society through social justice education, pedagogy, theory, and praxis. Praxis is literally putting this theory into action. And so that's what I invite you to do in this class, is think about the theories that we're offering you and try to think about how you can put them into practice in your own lives, whether it be at work or at home or in the classroom, in the different classes that you're taking or engaging in. Think about how you can become an agent of transformational resistance. That's essentially what my work is in terms of my research, and also one of the goals of this class is to ask people kind of where they fit in that scope of work as well. And again, I said I would end with an example. So in 2006, 2007, there was a wide-scale immigrant rights movement going on in the country. And one of the things that I noticed was that students in kinder through 12th grade were really engaged in speaking out against the discrimination that they and their family members were experiencing. And so what you see even today is students, walking out of school or, creating educational forums. This is students that were at Canyon Springs who walked out of their school and they were asking people, how are you different from me, right? Why am I experiencing discrimination as a brown person or as an immigrant in this country? And part of that, you'll see them, kind of exercising their right to speak out, their freedom of speech, and also their right for a civil engagement. And so they're talking about their human and equal rights for all immigrants. And this is, a really important movement that's going on in the country right now. There's still widespread discrimination against many immigrant communities. And I think this is something that we can ask ourselves. Again, what is the conformist, the self-defeating, and the reactionary behavior that is behind immigrant discrimination, and how can we be more transformative and less self-defeating, conformist, and reactionary? And how can we see individuals as valuable regardless of their race, ethnicity, regardless of where they were born, regardless of their immigration status, etc.